and gentlemen, welcome to the final thrilling installment of Bill of Rights Book Fair to celebrate the 224th anniversary of the Bill of Rights. I'm Jeffrey Rosen, the president of the National Constitution Center, which is the only institution in America chartered by Congress to disseminate information about the U.S. Constitution on a nonpartisan basis. And you've just heard a veritable constitutional feast of arguments this morning and history and all sorts of wonderful constitutional learning. And what a great book to conclude on we have before us. You're in for a final constitutional treat. Sandy Levinson has decided to read the Federalist Papers in the 21st century. And he's taken this canonical book written by Madison Hamilton and John Jay, and he encapsulates the essential argument that each of the Federalist Papers is making, and then he channels its relevance for the 21st century. And this is an extraordinarily creative book. There are few books that display a creativity of mind that changes the debate and implants them on the reader's memory. You know, Sandy, our friend Bruce Ackerman used to have a grading system in law school. It was either check, which was what most people got, or I for idea. And if you had an idea, that was a big deal. And this book has, what is it? It's almost 80 ideas. It's just, and the book is a large idea because it is the sign of a great, one of the nation's greatest, deepest, broadest constitutional scholars at the height of his power, channeling the Federalist and seeing what it has to say about modern questions. So it's a great book. You've got to read it. Let me just give some of Sandy's impressive formal titles. He currently holds the W. St. John Garwood and W. St. John Garwood Jr. Centennial Chair in Law at Harvard Law School. Wow.
University of Texas.
At the University of Texas, even better. But after, if you've got two Garwoods, then you need to have a longer law school name as well. He's the author of 350 articles and book reviews, including his most recent books include Framed, America's 51 Constitutions and the Crisis of Governance, and Our Undemocratic Constitution, Where the Constitution Goes Wrong. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Sandy Levinson. Okay, the obvious first question, especially pertinent in this case, what gave you the confidence and creativity to try to channel the Federalist Papers for a modern age?
Well, to some extent, this goes back to my previous book, Framed, which, among other things, is an attempt to understand what reasons were offered for particularly the structural parts of the Constitution. Quite frankly, although I like the Bill of Rights, I'm delighted to celebrate them, I have become more Publian in viewing the Bill of Rights as more akin to what they often call parchment barriers. That is, subject to changes depending on who's in power, whether it's First Amendment, 14th Amendment, or the like, whereas the structural parts are impervious to change. You can't run off to a court. So I spent quite a bit of time in that book looking at the arguments made, why the Electoral College, why bicameralism, why the presidential veto, and stuff like that. And then I just got intrigued by the more general question of whether the Federalists really can speak to us today, not necessarily in terms of unalloyed wisdom. That is, they got it right, and we should just open it as a text for how we ought to behave. But rather, these were obviously unusually intelligent and politically sophisticated people wrestling with genuine problems, most of which we're still wrestling with. But I would want to put one caveat. It is true that Madison, Hamilton, and Jay wrote the Federalist Papers, but one of the strategies of the book is, quite frankly, to be utterly indifferent to the historical personages of Hamilton, Madison, and Jay, and the extent, for example, were they necessarily being sincere with the reader? To what extent in understanding that? Mary Builder's comments this morning are certainly appropriate. To what extent do you have to view these as strategic interventions in 18th century politics? I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in, here are essays written by somebody called Publius. The only thing we know about Publius is the text of the essays. They were op-eds in 1788. They could be op-eds in the New York Times today. What do we get? What would we think if we saw Federalist #1 and then marching through to Federalist 85, written by this anonymous guy or woman, Publius, who's making really interesting arguments?
Wonderful. Well, this is an easy interview to structure because the book is so beautifully and sensibly structured. You begin by encapsulating the core argument of the paper, and then, as you say, march from 1 to 85. And you begin in Federalist 1 by saying that Publius, the synonym for either Hamilton, Madison, or Jay, tells his audience, it seems to have been reserved to the people of this country, by their conduct and example, to decide the important question whether societies of men are really capable or not of establishing good government from reflection and choice, or whether they're forever destined to depend for their political constitutions on accident and force. Riff, if you will, and this is just such a central question that suffuses all of the essays, are today's Americans, given the internet, given polarization, given the culture of dissent that Mel Urofsky was just talking about, still capable of basing their government on reflection and choice rather than accident and force?
That is really the most important single question. Incidentally, and here's, I think, why it makes a difference whether you focus on the actual author or the kind of the fictive author. If you didn't know that Alexander Hamilton wrote this, most of us would think, I believe, well, you know, this really sounds Jeffersonian. This is full of belief in the capacity of more or less ordinary Americans to engage in reflection and choice. Did Hamilton really believe this? Who knows? But he thought it was important to lead off in the voice of Publius to express this remarkable degree of confidence in his fellow citizens. The central question, I think, facing the country in 2015, 2016 coming up, is whether we share that confidence. Do we tend to view people who disagree with as capital O others who are not really capable of engaging in reflection and choice, and who are the products of what Publius and other essays will call simple passion, but you really can't trust them? And rightly or wrongly, Federalist 1 is suffused with an Enlightenment, I would even say Jeffersonian notion of faith in the people to think reflectively of politics. And the real question to the people in the audience today, and to anybody who happens to be watching this today, is, do you share this belief? Was reflection and choice a one-time event in 1787-88, and thereafter it's our role simply to venerate each and every decision they made, rather than, I would say, think for ourselves about what in the Constitution do we want to venerate, and what in the Constitution, quite frankly, needs change?
Well, because it's such an important question, I want to take another beat on this. Obviously, the great attendees here at the National Constitution Center at America's Town Hall are devotees of reflection and choice. You've chosen to devote a day to educate yourself about the Constitution. Our great C-SPAN viewers who are watching this program are in the same spirit, taking the time to really dig into hard arguments. Susan Swain, the wonderful president of C-SPAN, said the other night how lucky C-SPAN is not to have, they're not allowed to take ratings. They don't have to tailor their programs based on the audience. They can actually perform an educational mission. By contrast, I'm told by both federal and state elected officials that the polarizing phenomenon of social media, where the tweets and posts that get the most attention are the most extreme, and those tend to create mob effects that create further polarization, make this sort of reasoned, rational dialogue difficult. What are your thoughts, Sandy, about whether technology has made reason and choice impossible?
Well, again, since neither of us has the rest of the day for a full discussion, all I can do is to say that that's something we need to wrestle with. There, as you very well know, since you've written on this, there are optimistic takes on social media. It is social media that are leading, I think, to long overdue reexamination of police practices and the betterment of the society, whether it's the videos or the tweets or whatever. We all can cite wicked aspects of social media. I think the jury is still out on the overall contribution or costs of social media, but it's something we have to take into account. But all of it boils down to the fact that American political leaders, I mean, you've dwelt very amusingly on the nonpartisan aspect of the center.
There's nothing amusing about it. I'm very serious.
Yeah, I mean, you are. But, both Democratic and Republican presidents, at least since the time of Woodrow Wilson, and you can also go back to Lincoln if you wish, really embraced democracy in one way or another as the meaning of the American project. That wasn't true of Publius. Publius was not a little D-Democrat, except ironically in Federalist I, where there is this much, as I argue, much more Jeffersonian aspect. But to take the most inspiring and also most cliched sentence, at least since the Declaration of Independence, government of the people, by the people, and for the people, there is a huge difference between government by the people and government for or of the people. Government for the people can very easily defend certain notions of enlightened despotism or the monarchy. It's government by the people that really defines one important notion of democracy. And as I say, this notion has been embraced by George W. Bush, by Barack Obama, and you can just go back in time. And do we really believe it? Because whether you talk about the social media, whether you talk about, well, most people just don't have enough education or enough time or enough incentive, all of us know the various critiques of mass democracy. And these critiques are very intelligent. But if we don't have the Publian faith expressed in Federalist I, then I think we really do have to rethink through our notion of democracy and what we mean by democracy, so that when either George W. Bush or Barack Obama or whoever succeeds them will say, well, we in the United States really are committed to democracy in Tunisia or God knows where, what do they mean by democracy? Whom do we trust actually to have the capacity to be a democratic citizen? And if we don't trust one another in this country, very high literacy rates, a pretty good economy, a culture that expresses at least formal commitment to constitutional institutions. But if we don't trust people who disagree with us, frankly, to make tolerable choices, even if we disagree with them, we say, okay, you won the election fair and square. That's a separate problem we could talk about. what fair and square elections might look like. But if you won the election fair and square, we'll let you pass your programs, and then I hope we vote you out in the next election. All of these raise the most important of issues. I think the Federalist discusses many of these issues, and I think they're rarely discussed, certainly at the level that Publius discusses them in contemporary politics.
Well, we are going to discuss them. And let's move to Federalist 2, because that is relevant to this notion of what principles the Federalist or Publius relied on for the kind of trust with those whom we disagree. You quote Publius as saying that Providence had been pleased to give this one connected country to one united people, a people descended from the same ancestors, speaking the same language, professing the same religion, attached to the same principles of government, very similar in their manners and customs. Then you ask whether these Federalist 2 Publians, who are concerned or terrified that the American we is becoming irreparably fragmented, are right or wrong. I have to ask you, what would Publius have made of Donald Trump? It's the obvious question.
Yep.
And in a multicultural society in which this homogeneity not only doesn't exist, but is not even considered desirable, can the kind of democracy Publius expected persist?
Let me just preface my answer with, I hope, a short comment. One of the things that I hope for from this book is that people actually read the Federalist in its entirety. If I could rewrite one sentence in this book, it would be, I think, almost literally the first or second sentence, where I refer to the Federalists as not only the most widely cited, but also the most widely read document in American political thought, other than the Declaration of Independence or the Gettysburg Address. I now believe I was simply wrong in saying widely read, because I've now had a chance to ask students at the Harvard Law School and at the University of Chicago Law School, both terrific law schools, how many of them had read the Federalist in its entirety. One LLM student from abroad at Harvard had read it in its entirety. Most people, if they read any of the Federalist, have read about half a dozen of them. And it doesn't include usually numbers 1 or 2. So now let me turn to your question. Number 2, I think, is one of the most fascinating of all the 85, and for better and for worse, so directly relevant to our politics today, really to be remarkable. It is obvious that Publius in 1787 was wildly off the mark in describing America at that time as homogeneous in the way described. We didn't speak the same language. Benjamin Franklin was extraordinarily upset that there were German speakers in Pennsylvania. Even if you believe that all Catholics and all Protestants can really be subsumed into a single Christian religion, there were actually even some non-Christians around in 1787, 88. And you can march through all of these categories. So in a different sort of interview, that is, if this really were about the history of the 18th century, you would say, how in the world could he get it so wrong? But I think the answer to that question is deceptively simple, that it was important to persuading people that we could, in fact, unite into this very, very large country from the perspective of political theory and also politics, extending from Maine to the southern border of Georgia over to the east bank of the Mississippi, that we could actually make a go of it. And so the argument is, yes, we can make a go of it because we're so much alike. One of the anti-federalists, Agrippa, attacks the Constitution and says, how can we possibly believe that people from Georgia and people from Massachusetts really share enough of a sensibility to unite in a strong centralized government in which Congress will have vastly more powers? than under the Articles of Confederation. So the answer to that question is, look, people in Massachusetts and people in Georgia are really the same. Okay, forget history. Do the fast forward, and it remains a genuine, deep, troubling question of how much diversity, how much pluralism can any particular society tolerate before the fragmentation simply tears it apart. I segue in my essay from Publius to Sam Huntington, a great and controversial political scientist at Harvard. He died 5 or 6 years ago, but his last book, which I don't particularly agree with, but that's beside the point, his last book expressed great concern, particularly about immigration to the United States from Latin America, because he argued this was making it less likely, and he was false empirically, that people would learn English, that element of commonality. He quotes Federalist 2, and he really does say we should be worried about this. Now, I don't quite share Huntington's worries, but to put it mildly, he was no fool. And one does wonder, and now we do have Donald Trump certainly playing the Publian card, and in, I regard as a very unattractive way, but I do think that one has to recognize that it is a Publian card. There are, many things one can denounce your unfavorite candidates, whoever they might be from any political party, for violating the wisdom of the founders and breaking our constitutional traditions and stuff like that. But one does have to recognize the extent to which Publius really thought homogeneity was important. He was willing, from my perspective, it would be ungenerous to say lie through his teeth, but simply present a distorted picture of the United States, even in 1787, because it would have been so counter to the project of creating the United States, or the kind of United States that Publius wanted, to admit we're not the same race, we don't necessarily speak the same language, we're not the same religion, we don't have a common background, we don't have necessarily common manners. We will, in fact, end up killing 750,000 Americans between 1861 and 1865 over slavery and other differences among the regions. So these are real questions. Secession, civil war is overhanging some of the discussions of Publius. And quite obviously, these are not merely 18th century concerns.
I love the way you put our modern debates into historical context, and I can just see the next tweet from the real Donald Trump playing the Publian card.
What can one say?
Excellent. Okay, so the next section, part 2, has a series of essays from Federalist 9 through 14 that have to do with the theme that you called bigger is in fact better. And as you summarize the broad themes, Publius is responding to Montesquieu, who had said that Republican forms of government required small territories and homogeneous populations, as Federalist 2 suggests. But Publius says Montesquieu got it backward. Small territories like the American states and homogeneous people are more likely to generate tyranny of the majority, which is one faction's ability to dominate another. And it's only in an extended republic that you can have more protection, making it harder for a local faction to gain national power. There's lots to say in each of these essays, but I want to ask broadly, has technology, once again, changed the analysis? Our extended republic now taking place online, does that confirm or vitiate Publius's confidence that the broader the republic, the less likely you can have factions to dominate each other?
Well, again, with regard to your specific question, I want to hedge and say only time will tell, because you can easily offer competing analyses. What I think is so crucial about particularly, well, it's 9, 10, and 14, which are the extended republic arguments. I do want to come back for just literally about 30 seconds to 11 in a few moments. That I think Steve Calabrese is a mutual friend of ours, the head of the Federalist Society, which I think is helping to sponsor this.
A member of our great Coalition Freedom Advisory Board.
And I have suggested to Steve that there is something misleading about using James Madison as the central figure for the Federalist Society, because, and here I will talk about the particular author of number 10, no essay in our history is more critical of federalism than Federalist 10, insofar as it's a portrayal of states as dens of faction, that the only way we're really going to protect liberty in this country is to move to a larger and larger republic, so that when Justice Kennedy cites the Federalists, as he often does, to support the notion of state autonomy and states' rights, he's not citing number 10. He's not citing the arguments made there about the centrality of the extended republic. There are 2 points, though, worth making about the extended republic argument, putting to one side the Montesquieuian tradition, or David Hume and others. First of all, what Publius was thinking of was a republic, as I said just a few moments ago, that extended from Maine to South Georgia, east bank of the Mississippi, 4 million people, according to the census of 1790. He's not thinking of a republic that extends to the mid-Pacific and, depending on your theory of Puerto Rico, into the Caribbean, with roughly 320 million people. Putting to one side, of course, the diversity issue that we were talking about a moment ago. So do the arguments for extension from, say, Virginia to the whole Atlantic coast necessarily work to extend to the mid-Pacific and to go from 4 million people to 320 million people? Now, let's say for the moment you accept the argument that actually the extended republic is congruent with what the Constitution calls a Republican form of government or the Lincolnian democratic project. Then I think the unexpectedly interesting question that arises from reading these particular essays is, well, should we expand even more into more transnational government or ultimately world government? I mean, the Publian questions in this section are central to understanding what's going on in Europe. Europe is sovereign states like Georgia or Massachusetts or whatever, trying to create a new identity, a new polity. Are they going to be successful in it or not? But if they are, why not keep going?
Doesn't the homogeneity comes back into play here? Because as you note, with the debate over devolution in Scotland, unless there's a shared political culture and shared tradition, then consolidation doesn't work. So wouldn't that be a Publian argument against world government?
I mean, here's how it depends which of the essays one wants to focus on. And I make no argument in the book. In fact, it's not something, it's not part of the project of the book to say that there's a single Publian theory in which everything fits together. Rather, I think the Publius of number 2, in particular, your question is a hands-down winner. That if you don't have a certain degree of homogeneity, whatever that certain degree is, then the project of political unity whether you're talking about the United States or Europe or the Bolivarian project in South America, whatever, is hopeless. On the other hand, if you choose to focus on 9, 10, and 14, you might be more optimistic about this.
Just because this is important, does it matter, going back to Publius talks about a people descended from the same ancestors, speaking the same language, professing the same religion, attached to the same principles of government, similar in their manners and customs. Do you need the same ancestors and ethnic background? Is it merely enough to be attached to the same principles of government?
I would hope so. This actually, I think, is what in an earlier book I described as our constitutional faith.
A beautiful book.
That being said, one of the disturbing challenges set down by Sam Huntington was the critique of this as just too thin, too much a reflection of an Enlightenment confidence in abstract ideas to bind a nation together. And I would like to think that Huntington is wrong, but I do think that the great test was and remains whether what Robert Jackson called the magnificent generalities of the Constitution or the Bill of Rights are enough to bind us together. Because again, as you know even far more than I do, we're at swords point right now in this country over what religious freedom means. So it can be the case that all of us, each and every one of us, says, I believe in the First Amendment. And then after 10 minutes, we discover that we really are at swords point, or coming from the University of Texas, that the argument about affirmative action is ultimately a debate about competing theories of equality. It is not the case that people like myself who support affirmative action are egalitarians and people who oppose it are anti-egalitarians. Rather, there's just fundamental conflict over what equality means.
One more beat on the extended republic. Mel Urofsky and I are obviously great fans of Louis Brandeis, who attacked the curse of bigness in business and government, felt that only in small-scale republics, like the Athenian polis or the Jeffersonian shires, could citizens become attached enough to the principles of self-government and also master the facts that were necessary for political participation in order to succeed. And I have talked to state government officials today who say that they are immune to some of the polarizing factors in Washington, less under the media spotlight, actually attached to their constituents, better able to preside over participatory self-government. So is it possible that Publius was wrong?
Sure. As I say, there is nothing in the book that is committed to the notion that Publius always got it right. There are some essays where I'm very critical of the Publian arguments, as with number 2. There are other essays where I point out that immediately the actual governors of the country rejected what Publius described. This has interesting implications for the originalist project, but Publius assures us, this I think is number 70, 71, that just as presidents will have to get the agreement of the Senate in order for somebody to become a cabinet official, so will it be the case that presidents will have to get the agreement of the Senate to fire a cabinet official. You know, you talk about checks and balances, separation of powers, that we don't have kind of pure separation of powers with regard to choosing cabinets. It's a shared view, and Publius very solemnly tells us it will be a shared view as to who gets fired. Didn't turn out that way. One of the very, very first decisions made by the very first Congress was that George Washington, and it's not completely irrelevant that it was George Washington, could fire at will, and that has stuck. There are other essays where it's not simply that we today might say, well, you know, I'm not sure this Publian argument is right. But you would say they didn't think it was right even then. What I admire about the framing generation, about both Jefferson and Hamilton, is the spirit of Federalist One. These were people who really did think for themselves. And my favorite paragraph in all of the 85 is the end of Federalist 14, where the emphasis is that to be an American is not to be, in essence, trapped in tradition or what Publius called names, which is simply saying, ironically enough, because Madison or Hamilton said this, it must be right. But rather, it's learning the lessons of experience. And they did that. They overthrew a king, and then, as Mary Bilder pointed out this morning, overthrew the first American Constitution because they thought, in the language of Federalist 15, it was imbecilic. And my fear, quite frankly, is that for all of the polarization, for all of the really terrible aspects of American politics today, there is astonishingly little discussion going on about the extent to which we might need constitutional reform. And you can't read the Federalists, you can't read the discussions of that time without realizing that these are people who did believe in constitutional reform and who were willing to act on it. Whereas today, we have a cult of the founders. We think that we honor the founders by saying, well, they must have gotten everything right, rather than really engaging with them.
What is a republic? You raised that question in your discussion of Federalist 39 and the associated essays. You say that it wasn't anything close to a modern democracy, since the people's indirect choice of senators through state legislators was part of the original design. But it wasn't clear in Federalist 39 which people was indirectly represented. Was it the people of each state or the people of the United States as a whole? And that had huge consequences for whether or not states were allowed to secede. So what does Publius tell us about that?
Well, I mean, what Publius says in 39 is that we're a mixture of national and state. And it is 39 that Justice Kennedy likes to cite, because 39 is a much more benevolent view of states and the role that states play. So again, let me wear my two hats. The one hat as an historian to say, well, how do you explain 39 after 10? And the other essays that really are defending what the critics of the Constitution called a consolidated government or a consolidated national government. I think the answer is easy, that these are the greatest pieces of propaganda, of motivated op-ed essays in the history of the world, that they were directed at wavering delegates, particularly in New York. New York ratified the Constitution by the overwhelming vote of 30 to 27. A switch of 2 from the pro to the cons would have said no, and given where New York is located, unlike Rhode Island and North Carolina, which had not ratified the Constitution when George Washington took the oath of office in 1789, it would have made a huge difference had New York said no. And the people who were most skeptical of the Constitution were people who said, look, you're creating this strong, overbearing national government, and so one point of 39 is to say no. we're not. So now you do the fast forward. Forget about the history. What's in it for us today to read 39? Well, you've already suggested in a way by citing Brandeis, by citing, you didn't cite him, I did, Justice Kennedy, or Steve Calabrese, or other people who really take federalism in some ways more seriously than I usually do, that they make thoughtful arguments that smaller is better, that it is more Athenian. It does offer the possibility for more deliberation, not to mention whatever advantages you get, which are debatable, but there are certain advantages to greater homogeneity of populations, less likelihood of simple fragmentation into warring sides. And so 39, my essay concludes 39 by quoting from the statue in front of the Texas State Capitol defending secession. And as you would expect, the statue says nothing about slavery. It's all in the terms, actually Declaration of Independence, government by consent of the governed. And so the great wild card in any federal system throughout the world, whether it's the United States, Canada, Spain, Italy, even the UK, which is becoming more federal, what if the subnational unit says, we no longer feel satisfied, can we secede? And I think our mutual friend, Akhil Amar, always gets very, very upset with me.
And me.
When I suggest that the argument for secession is not a dumb argument, that I am confident that each and every one of us in this room, wherever we are in the political spectrum, each of us supports at least one secessionist movement going on today in the world, and each of us is absolutely appalled by at least one secessionist movement that's going on in the world today. But once you recognize that that if you really truly believe in a certain vision of self-government that you can find, say, in 39, then secession does raise its head.
Akhil was here discussing his great book, The Law of the Land, a few months ago, and I recalled that during our first week in law school, I was this cheeky law student, we had a big argument over Federalist 39 and whether secession was unconstitutional at the time the Federalist was written, or whether, as I said, it took the Civil War. But he found this Madison quote, which seemed to suggest that Madison thought secession was unconstitutional. So as usual, he had the last word. But I want to keep moving to a point that you make in your discussion of Federalist 62, to the degree that the framers thought that the indirect election of senators by the state legislatures was crucial for preserving state rights, some today feel that the 17th Amendment, which guaranteed the direct election of senators, was a huge blow to states' rights. Utah's Mike Lee, who's I'm delighted and honored to share, is now a visiting scholar at the National Constitution Center, along with Senator Chris Coons of Delaware. Senator Mike Lee has described the 17th Amendment as a mistake. Rick Perry calls it a populist rage, and Justice Scalia told a University of Chicago audience in 2010 and the Union League audience here 2 weeks ago that he would recommend changing the Constitution back to what they wrote. The 17th Amendment has changed things enormously. You can trace the decline of so-called states' rights throughout the rest of the 20th century. What are these critics correct?
They're correct in one respect. Descriptively, of course they're correct, that the 17th Amendment cuts the last plausible argument that the Senate has anything to do with protecting federalism. If you define federalism as the protection of autonomous state power, that the argument of the original Constitution is that, well, if state legislatures hired senators And they couldn't fire them. They weren't ambassadors, but they could refuse to rehire them after 6 years. And this would generate an incentive on the part of senators to be concerned about protecting the prerogatives of state governments. Once you have the 17th Amendment, senators are elected by the population at large, who may or may not have any interest in preserving the prerogatives of state government, as against embracing, let us say, the New Deal state, national state. From my perspective, the modern Senate is nothing more than an indefensible affirmative action program for the residents of small states. It has nothing to do with protecting federalism. If you do believe that protecting the autonomy interests of states is really important, then Scalia and my former governor and Senator Lee are correct. At that point, it turns from an empirical issue as to what are the consequences of shifting election systems to, is the 17th Amendment a good idea or a bad idea? I like the idea that we get to vote for senators. I wouldn't repeal the 17th Amendment, but just as I don't believe that defenders of secession as a constitutional possibility are simply stupid and beyond the pale, I certainly don't think that this criticism of the 17th Amendment is stupid. Rather, it calls on us to engage in reflection and choice on how we wish to be governed. 100 years ago, we decided that we wished to be governed by ourselves rather than by state legislatures with regard to choosing senators. I think that was a good decision that we ought to stick with. But I like the idea that we would actually have a serious discussion provoked by senators and Supreme Court judges and governors so that we can actually argue it out rather than simply say, well, this is the way we do things. And how can you possibly think we could do it any way else?
You've argued that our Constitution is flawed for being undemocratic. Is it possible in a more democratic, more technologically transparent age to make arguments against direct democracy?
Again, you know, a lot of your questions boil or return to the absolutely crucial issue of, given modern technology, is this conducive or ultimately fatal to any kind of democratic project? Let me admit flat out that I'm probably different from most of my friends and family in actually having some good things to say about direct democracy. And the earlier book, which Jeff mentioned, framed America's 51 constitutions and the crisis of governance. The point of the title is that there are actually 51 constitutions in the United States. American lawyers, particularly at elite law schools, tend to believe there's only one constitution. And indeed, we're at the center that would lead you to believe that there's really only one constitution worth thinking about. But one of the things that is distinctive about the United States Constitution, it's not only that relative to many other constitutions across the world, it is undemocratic, but relative to 49 of the 50 other state of the constitutions, it's undemocratic, because 49 of the 50 state constitutions include some role for direct democracy. Federalist 63 is where Publius makes it very, very clear that there should be no direct role for we the people in governance. The only thing we should ever do at the national level is vote for representatives who will do our thinking for us, who will make the decisions for us. If you look at the states, as well as other countries around the world, including Switzerland or New Zealand, which we don't view as crazy countries, or within the United States, I like to focus on Maine and Ohio rather than California, because there is the widespread view, fair or not, that California is just crazy, whereas nobody ever says this about Maine or Ohio. But direct democracy can be a very important safety valve. And I think that one of the things that explains the tremendous anger in contemporary American politics, at the national level especially, is an all too plausible belief that elections really don't matter much at the national level, because if you want to change things, if you like the status quo, then that's terrific. But if you actually think that change is necessary, and again, I don't think it matters from this perspective whether you're on the left, right, or center. We would have different notions of what are the principal challenges facing us and what kinds of changes we might need. But you realize that in order for anything truly significant to happen at the national level, you have to capture control of the House, the Senate, the presidency, and maybe even the Supreme Court. You can't think as you can in many, particularly the Western states, but not only the Western states, of saying, there's a safety valve, that if the established institutions just become too sclerotic, too caught up in gridlock, or simply captured by the interests, there is a way we can do an end run around this. We have no such way at the national level, and it does seem to me that if we ever had a new constitutional convention, one of the very, very important questions we want to ask is not, should we replace representative government with direct democracy? That would be lunatic. Rather, the correct question, I think, would be, did the founders make the right decision when they rejected even a scintilla of an iota of direct democracy and focus exclusively on representative democracy, including, and here it's valuable to go back to the 17th Amendment, including the Senate that wouldn't even be elected by we the people, it would be state legislatures. We have this Byzantine system of the Electoral College that prevents direct election. And I think all of these are worth talking about. And if you look at the states, and here's where I can play the Brandeisian Federalist hat, the states are laboratories of experimentation on more little d democratic governance, for better and for worse.
So we need to get to questions because they're great, and we haven't yet talked about Congress, the executive, the judiciary, the separation of powers, and the rest. You, years ago, commissioned a great, if rather cheeky project where you asked me and a bunch of your other colleagues to write about constitutional stupidities. What was the worst provision of the Constitution? Out of all of the remaining aspects of the Federalist Papers that Publius discusses, what did he get most wrong?
It's easy to pick on the Electoral College because, in fact, I think the Electoral College was and remains indefensible. At a deeper level, I think what he gets most wrong is Federalist 49, which runs completely counter to the inspiration that I get from Federalist 1 and Federalist 14 about thinking for ourselves, including the possibility of quite radical thinking for ourselves. Number 49 is the attack on Thomas Jefferson. You know, as I said before, you might actually think that number 1 was written by Jefferson if you didn't know who Publius was. You're not going to make that mistake with 49, because 49 is a thoroughgoing attack on Jefferson and Jefferson's belief that it would be a good idea to have frequent conventions and return to the people for reflection and choice and how we ought to be governed into the future. Instead, the theme of 49 is this is really dangerous. What you need is veneration. You need to recognize that the planets were almost uniquely aligned in Philadelphia in 1787. It was never going to happen again, and Jefferson is just a dangerous lunatic. And at a deep level, I think that is the most problematic of the 85 essays, because, you know, as you know, there are people who say the Electoral College isn't one of the great features of our system, but at the end of the day, it isn't that important, and we could argue, you know, for quite a bit about what the empirical evidence would show. But this attitude that the Constitution is simply to be venerated rather than to be reflected on is what I am most deeply critical of.
Great. Well, in that Jeffersonian spirit, we have a question which asks you to reflect further on that. The question says, the Constitution Center's line, "Join the conversation," suggests that we talk about the Constitution. Your title, "An Argument Open to All," suggests that we should argue, as the Federalists did, whether or not we should have a Constitution. What's your take?
That's absolutely correct. I mean, I would say, and I'll put on yet a third hat of political science, my first degree, that I do think any moderately complex society needs a written constitution, largely on the structural aspects. You can have an unwritten constitution and a lot of custom with regard actually to protecting rights. But it's where you have to decide, okay, who's going to be able to make the laws? How are they going to get to the office in the first place? How long can they stay around? Those really aren't subject to, well, there'll be a reasonable number of people who will be elected for a reasonable length of time. No, you really want to say, you're in here for 4 years, there are going to be 100 of them or whatever. So the question is not whether we need a constitution or not. We do need a constitution. The question is, to what extent are we well served in 2015 by the Constitution we have today? Are there, again, citing Publius, are there imbecilic features of the Constitution that we ought to modify? And maybe yes, maybe no. You know, the person writing the question got it absolutely right. What I want to promote, and what I think Publius does promote, is an argument open to all. Let's talk about it. And that's what I really see lacking so much in contemporary politics. We prefer to attack our opponents as bad people or whatever. We don't talk about the extent to which our institutions are well structured to allow governance.
I think we have time. Well, two questions if you answer this one quickly, because it's a good one, and then I'll give you the last one. With so many politicians and political leaders speaking out against Washington, the role of central government, is there a modern Publius speaking for the role of a national government and a national people today?
Again, terrific question. Quick answer is not enough. Again, you know, we talked much later.
Any names though? I mean, who would be closest?
One might have expected President Obama or Bill Clinton, two unusually gifted orators, to make the argument that every single time disaster relief is sent to Iowa or Florida or Oklahoma because of easily foreseeable hurricanes or floods or tornadoes, but money is taken from people who live in Pennsylvania and sent elsewhere. This is a national welfare state in action based on the premise that for all of our differences, we really are part of a common country. So if tornadoes wipe out a community in Kansas or Oklahoma, then we in Massachusetts or you in Pennsylvania will help out through taxes. Clinton and Obama really haven't done this. Governors, including our former governor Rick Perry, was not hesitant to ask for disaster relief, and the president signing the forms never really made the argument that I think they ought to make.
Okay, so far then, no Publius. We'll have to keep thinking. Last question is open-ended but meaningful. The framers expected people in certain roles to behave certain ways, including, as you've discussed, completely excluding the people in their direct capacity from any policymaking role. Thinking forward in the 21st century, what new roles might be expected of the people that could be addressed in law and in the Constitution?
I don't know that it's a new role. I think that the naive expectation, here's where your discussion with Mel is so relevant. When you read with such genuine passion from the Whitney dissent, and it is one of the great opinions in American history, there's no doubt about that. He was an Athenian. What Brandeis said is that the best life is one that engages with public affairs. It is not the private life. Most of us disagree, either theoretically or simply in terms of our behavior, that the demands of private life are very real. You can't scoff at people who say, I don't have enough time to read a book like this or really to become up to speed on the pros or cons of the Trans-Pacific Trade Agreement. I have to try to feed my family or the like. And that was the central question in 1787. It's a central question today. What we saw, my wife and I saw Hamilton Sunday afternoon, and what united Hamilton and Jefferson, John Adams, is that they were completely political people in the best sense of the word. They left their families behind to go to London or Paris or become Secretary of the Treasury. And I think one can say whatever one's views of Hamilton or Jefferson, it's pretty hard to be both at one and the same time, that each was genuinely Publian in being committed to creating a country that they wanted to live in as citizens. And how do you generate that spirit? I don't know.
Beautiful. Well, I'm going to encourage that point and to say that, as on that Brandeisian note, you realize the importance of what you've done today, ladies and gentlemen, for coming here for Bill of Rights Day. You have listened to complicated arguments. You've listened attentively. I've seen your eyes. You've engaged with them. And you followed Brandeis's counsel that the greatest threat to freedom is an inert people, that public discussion is a political duty, that is the fundamental principle of an American government. If we will govern by the light of reason, we must let our minds be bold. You are embracing and embodying that notion. So are our great C-SPAN viewers. I do have to use this Brandeisian appeal to make the obvious plug as well, which is, and this is important if you want these programs to keep going, I always recite our congressional charter, which is so inspiring. So people think we get a lot of federal money. Actually, we get almost no federal funds. Our programs like this depend almost entirely on the support of members and viewers like you. What I want you to do, you don't have to give a lot of money, but I want you to go to the Constitution website and just join, become a member. You'll find out about our phenomenal programs, you'll get our tweets and videos, and you'll become engaged in this great national project of constitutional education. We're going to go across the country and bring in more and more people to teach themselves, to educate themselves so that they can participate in the conversation, make up their own mind, and celebrate this great document, the Bill of Rights. Happy birthday, Bill of Rights. Please join me in thanking Sandy Levinson. Thank you all for a great day.
Thank you. And I'm yours.
Let me just say, Sandy will sign his book outside, so please buy it and get it.